Hi everyone and welcome to Curious Convos. Today we have Professor Andy Hargreaves joining us from in Canada today. So thank you for joining us, Andy, and your generosity tonight. Well, it's tonight here, very early over there in the morning there, but thank you for being with us.
You're welcome, Andrea.
So let's get started about your book. I've read a few excerpts of it, but can you tell us how you got started on this particular topic in this book?
Yeah, this is the book. This is a book called Moving: A Memoir of Education and Social Mobility. And I'll read a bit from it for you in a few minutes. It's the only thing I'll read. I never usually read when I'm giving a talk, but this is an exception. And this is really a book about a working class upbringing in the north of England in the 1950s and 60s. So people may think, what on earth has that got to do with me if I'm younger, if I live in a different place, or if I'm not even working class? But this book is essentially about not just a rambling, nostalgic memoir, although you will find sex, violence, being in a band, and various other things, projectile vomiting, and various other things in there as well. But it's a serious book that is about the experience of social mobility. Social mobility is basically the chance we have to at least match and possibly improve on the life that our parents had, especially socioeconomically in terms of our jobs. It's really about the words of the old Curtis Mayfield song. Anybody who will remember it, it's about move on up towards your destination. But he also said, but you will find from time to time there's complications. So it's about the existence of social mobility, which is worse now in many countries than it's been since the 1970s, 1980s. So the evidence is over the last 30, 40 years that the opportunities for social mobility through education are actually declining rather than increasing. And this is happening as the inequalities in society are getting worse. We were drawn to this by a man called Piotr Sorokin. And Piotr Sorokin in the 1920s was the son of a Russian traveling tradesman who, a single father, came from a modest background, and he moved on to become professor at the University of St. Petersburg, where, because of his anti-communist views, he was imprisoned, threatened with being sentenced to death, and then exiled to North America, where he moved to Chicago, and then eventually on to Harvard to set up the sociology department at Harvard University. And in 1927, Sorokin invented and wrote a book about the concept of social mobility. And what he outlined for us, that social mobility means two things. There are differences in society, there are inequities, but mobility is about, is it fair so that people can move up and down depending on their talents and irrespective of the background that they came from. Less well known is that Sorokin had a second understanding of social mobility, and that is, how do we get the levels to move closer to each other so that the gaps and inequities in society are smaller? Most advocates of social mobility today, liberal, conservative governments will do this, are in favor of the first kind, which is, let's have an unequal society, but give people a lot of chance for movement. And don't really talk about the second kind, which is, as we have a lot of evidence on from people like Wilkinson and Pickett in the spirit level, that actually the closer your levels are together, the smaller the inequalities are, the more chance of mobility you have, because the rungs on the ladder aren't as far apart for you, basically. Yeah. And that when you move up, you're not moving up by yourself, but you're moving up with lots of people with you. So this is what we know about the extent of social mobility, which requires changes in society, so that, for example, we move more towards like being the Nordic countries, or like Canada, which have less inequality and higher social mobility, rather than countries such as the UK and the US, which have high inequality and low social mobility. And it's no accident that those things go together. But this book Moving, is not about the frequency of social mobility, though that's important. It's the experience of social mobility. But that is also linked to whatever your experience is like, whether it's positive or negative. What effect does that have on the barriers that are created for you? And in some ways, the barriers that you create for yourself that put a limit, in a way, on how far you might go. Now,
So
in the literature,
do you think that COVID has shone a light on that inequality at the moment?
So when this book came out at first in March, then we delayed it because of COVID-19. We had to cancel a whole book tour, including 5,000 people at one event in the UK with a Guardian journalist. We delayed the book until June, and at first I guess my very selfish worry was that in the midst of COVID, why would people want to read a bizarre memoir like this? But the truth is that COVID has highlighted two things. It's highlighted the importance of essential workers. Mm-hmm. And by essential workers, we mean not just health workers and teachers, of course, but we mean people who clean our houses, people who look after our children, people who clean the toilets in the airport, the railway station, people who serve us, are servers in the grocery store. And my mum was an essential worker. So my mum basically grew up in the Depression, married in wartime, raised three boys during austerity in a council house, a public house in the 1950s, 60s. And just when she was getting on her feet, just when Prime Minister Harold Macmillan said, "You've never had it so good," in the early 1960s, my dad died. And I was 12 years old, she was 43, and she had three boys to raise. And she, for a while, patched things together by working three jobs, cleaning people's houses, working in the local shop, looking after people's children, just to keep our heads above water. And eventually it got too much for her. And when it got too much for her, she had a nervous breakdown. She had agoraphobia. She couldn't get out of bed. She was depressed. Till about 11 in the morning, she became addicted to barbiturates. She had a number of physical illnesses that required hospitalization. And she stopped eating, essentially, other than a powder formula called Complan. And so I had two brothers working in factories. One of them would soon emigrate. And so really, like many kids of families such as this, they might be working class families, they might be immigrant families, might be poor families, because then we have to go on to welfare, basically. You suddenly find yourself in a position where instead of your family looking after you, you're looking after them. So I was around 14 by the time it hit this point. And the question is then, when you don't arrive at school until 11 o'clock in the morning, and you miss, for instance, in one term, you miss 5 weeks of absences, and you don't know your school knows until the truancy officer arrives at home. Then the question is how does your school respond to experiences like this? What is the experience of social mobility that they give you? And in the book, I talk about two in particular. There are others, but I talk about two in particular. One is how does one thing that suffered enormously from these absences during the mornings for a long time was maths achievement. So I almost failed my maths A level the first time round. But what I didn't, and for a long time I thought I was, till my 60s, I thought I was no good at maths, even though my arithmetic is brilliant, but my algebra is abominable. But what I didn't need at school was more maths instruction, more time on maths, more practice on maths. I needed a school, a secondary school, that understood, like my best primary school teacher did, that understood the whole of me and what was going on in my working class life. For now, you could substitute an immigrant life or an African American life or even an LGBT life, you know, people who have different kinds of things going on in their home. And to have a school that could engage with all of me so that they could actually help me with my learning and achievements. And the second thing is that I lived on one side of town, and by the age of 16 was now the only kid pretty much on my side of town going to the grammar school on the other side of town. So I had to manage things like having two sets of friends who did two sets of things. And I came home in the evenings. I would go out and play football and cricket with them because I didn't want to lose my friends at home in order to be successful at school. In order to be successful and move on up, we shouldn't have to leave behind the things and the people that we come from. So then I wouldn't do any homework till about 10 o'clock at night when everybody had gone to bed because there's no space to do homework. So I'd work from about 10 till midnight at 1 o'clock in the morning. Then I had 3 jobs because my mum couldn't, my mum couldn't give me anything. And I don't just mean jobs for having a good time. I mean jobs for buying a shirt with, jobs for buying a jacket with, that kind of thing. So I had to manage that as well. And then I was trying to get my mum kind of back on her feet. So I was trying to get her eating. I was trying to get her out, go with her because she wouldn't go on her own. Because I knew intuitively about the Oedipus complex, I wouldn't walk with her. I'd walk in the dark on the opposite side of the street, so nobody could see me. And then I got the local gang that I had to deal with as well, which led to me being the only kid in town, slightly built on my side of town, led to homophobic insults, though I didn't luckily understand actually what they meant at the time because I was pretty naive.
Yeah.
And they led to physical violence, and I had to learn not to run away from that or just to capitulate to it, but actually with no training or fighting instincts, somehow to be able to negotiate that, survive, and keep them away. And if you read the book, you'll read about how I was able to do that.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, all this is going on in a working class life. And meanwhile, you've got a history curriculum that teaches you about great men, politicians, prime ministers, popes, kings, queens, that have no relationship to your life whatsoever. And so I failed history the first time around because the curriculum was so alienating and disconnected. And when I took it the second time round, I realized the curriculum was going to be the same again. So I went to the local library, the public library. I looked at old examination papers and realized on there were always 3 questions, always, on social and economic history that my teachers didn't teach. The history of my people, the history of people who made things, built things. And so all year, I handed in wretched assignments on things I hadn't studied and wasn't interested in that got pitiful grades. I went into the library in the evenings to teach myself social and economic history. And I came away with a grade A, with a top grade at the end of the year. And to this day, my teachers probably thought I cheated because they were aghast when they handed out the results. So what I'm saying is these are the things in a working class life or an immigrant life or a minority life that many, many kids have to, this is the experience of social mobility. And the onus is not to give kids more grit, more resilience. I mean, God, they've already got grit and resilience in spades. They can't join clubs, they can't travel, they can't volunteer, they can't take on internships like the middle class kids can and stick it on their CV when they go to university. But nobody asks them, what responsibilities do you have in your family? Yeah. What leadership are you showing there? How can you put that on a form for university? So it's not just the kids who need to change when we're looking at social mobility. It's the systems and the schools and the universities that need to change as well.
Can I ask, Andy, when you were saying you were travelling to the grammar school and then you'd come back and you'd have your friends within the neighbourhood, did they give you a hard time about travelling to grammar, or were they just totally happy for you to be doing that?
So first of all, I had a group of friends, and I did very different things with these two groups of friends. At school, I had kind of artsy friends, so we did rambling Monty Python skits and things like that. Joined the local theatre.
Yeah.
So I was engaged in the local theatre a bit. So I kind of did things with them. Went round to their house on Saturday nights. Did a kind of an impersonation of Wayne's World, where we listened to rock music and kind of banged our heads like that.
Yeah.
So I got that with them, and then I had another set of friends at home where I played football with, cricket with, kind of hung out with a bit until I was older. Went train spotting with, and I was terrified that these two sets of friends would meet because they were so different. From, they spoke differently, they acted differently, they behaved differently, and we have many other narratives around of social mobility that describe the different ways in which people deal with this. So let me just go through a few. Yeah. So Tara Westover's book Educated is about being raised by Mormon scrap metal dealers in a physically violent family when she wasn't allowed to go to school in Idaho at age 14, and then ascended on to Cambridge University and did a PhD. And that is an American dream narrative of surviving improbable circumstances in order to have heroic success. Then you've got J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, New York Times bestseller, about growing up amongst, frankly, the white trash of Appalachia, and moving on to Yale. And his narrative is one of scorn and disgust for what he left behind. So he liked the stability of his grandma, but had no patience for the people who got food stamps and then traded in what they bought for packs of beer with their friends and wouldn't save up for the future. So very derisive about the people, glad to have moved on, glad to have moved away, and a bit contemptuous about where they came from. British narratives, because they're British, are much more like Hugh Grant angst-ridden. They're about, and they begin with D.H. Lawrence actually in Sons and Lovers, and they're about growing up in one community, moving on to another, and feeling like you belong to neither. You don't really belong to the people you've left. You're not really accepted by the people you moved to. And they wander around as kind of lonely artists, journalists, and so on in life. Then you've got Drake, the Canadian rap star, who has a song, says, comes from a modest background, started from the bottom, now my whole team effing here. And look at me before, now I'm thousands of dollars a show. So it's kind of defiant, in your face. You held me back, this is where I am, deal with it now. Yeah. Then you got Trevor Noah, who shows what this is like when race is factored in South Africa, and develops kind of irony, wit, satire, in order first just to deal with it amongst his friends and then turn that to political advantage. And then you got Tonya Harding. Tonya Harding was the first woman to perform the triple axel, and the judges, if you've seen the movie, were always trying to hold her back because she wanted to skate to rock and roll and not to orchestral classics. And things like our culture, our music, our TV watching, whether or not you like karaoke, I sing karaoke, I love to play pool, I'll go to any bar in town and take on anybody in that bar. These are a sign of who we are and how we fit in or don't fit in. And when the judges held her back, she became the first woman to perform a triple axel. And that was, okay guys, you hold me back, now I've done this. And for me, I don't know, my history, Ayla, I felt through my life continuously still, when the conventional forces hold me back, And there's a book about this called Strangers in Paradise, about working class people in the academy who say, even when they're the president of the university, they feel like they still don't belong. And I feel time after time, I periodically have to pull out a triple axle, so that compared to the person who went to Harvard or Yale or has all the right background and all the right connections and networks, I have no alumni of any note from the red brick university I went to. Compared to them, time and again, I have to pull out a triple axle. So the question is you have this gap in your life. You're from one side of town and living on the other side of town. How do you deal with that? How do you negotiate that? And the answer is, for me, it's a bit of many of them. There's no, for me, disgust and contempt, although I also come from Brexit Britain. So how do you go back and be loyal to the people you grew up with who are heart and soul, the salt of the earth, basically? Will give you the shirt off their back, will always help out a neighbor, who work hard all their lives, but who are racist, sexist, xenophobic, and so on. So how do you deal with that? So it's not only about how you deal with kind of the middle class who don't get what your origins are, and the white liberal middle class actually find it easier to deal with people. The white straight middle class find it easier to have empathy for the people they could never be, to be black, to be LGBT, to be immigrant. And good for them that they do that there is empathy. But what they have great difficulty, like Hillary Clinton, having empathy for, is the people they might one day become if things go south, right? Yeah. Or the people that they came from, that they've left behind. And so one of our greatest challenges with essential workers and Brexit and Trump and all that is, in order to have more empathy from the white working class for Black Lives Matter, for immigrants, for refugees, for LGBTQ, we have to have more empathy for the white working class itself, to acknowledge not just poverty, pitiable, to acknowledge who it is, what its strengths are, even though it has flaws. And when it has understanding and it has empathy and it is not a basket of deplorables, there will be less likelihood of racism, xenophobia, and exclusion towards all these other groups within society.
So when you were young, you had your two older brothers. I did. Did you rely on them?
So one of them's passed away now.
Yeah.
He passed away 3 years ago now.
So your life was very different to theirs?
Yeah, well, in England at the time, we had a thing called the 11 plus. It still exists, actually, in some parts of the UK. So this was a test at age 11. Which would decide whether you'd go to grammar school for the top 15, 20%, or whether you go to secondary modern school for the rest. At the age of 7, one of my first experiences I recall at school was I was called up to the headmistress's desk for a vocabulary test. I don't know if I've ever told you about this before.
No.
But it was a vocabulary test. And so obviously, because I remember it was there's a sense of weightiness to it. So I read all these words, and I read them and I read them and I read them. And I was barely 7. And then I remember the last word I could read, and the first and only word that I couldn't when the test stopped. And the last word I could read was pneumonia. And I knew what it meant. Which is not bad for 7, actually.
Yeah.
And the first word I couldn't read was phthis, Phsthis. Bet you don't even know what it means.
No, I don't.
It is, like pneumonia, a pulmonary wasting disease. So why you should have 2 items on a test for 7-year-olds that are both about pulmonary wasting diseases is, what were they thinking of, the people who made this test? So then I went up into primary school and I went into the A stream. And the kids who didn't pass the test went into the B stream. Years later in 2004, my primary school invited me back to lay the foundation stone for the new building. I did it with my best teacher, who really inspired and transformed my life, a woman called Mary Himble, who was the kind of teacher I always wanted to be, still do, actually. And when I was part of that, they sent me some old class lists. So they sent me the class lists of the kids who went into the A and B stream at age 7. And the class lists of the kids who left at 11 on whether they went to grammar school or to secondary modern school. I remembered almost all the kids in the A stream because I mixed with them. I went to their houses, I played out with them. And so I remembered almost nobody in the B stream. We never mixed. Even at 7, we were divided in terms of social class. About 70% of the kids in the A stream went on to grammar school. 0% of kids in the B stream went on to grammar school. All this was decided at age 7. My 2 brothers took the test. So then most kids went to secondary modern. About 2% went to a thing called a technical school in the middle, which was really for like commerce and trades. I passed the test. My middle brother went to technical school. My eldest brother went to secondary modern because he was accused of cheating in the test for asking for somebody else's rubber eraser. So he's very stubborn. So he walked out in disgust. And he never told my mum about it till she was in her 80s. And I remember in my 50s, I was with him. He's still alive now, lives out west in Canada and the US. And we're fixing something together. I said, Pete, you're so lucky because I'm hopeless at this. Like, you seem to know like exactly where everything goes. You have great skills. He said, I don't have any gifts for this. I don't have any skills for this at all. He said, my skills are art, music. He used to play the violin till he carried his case to secondary modern school and got a beating for it, and never touched a violin during the rest of his life. Opera, military history. He knows all of these in great detail. These are my skills, he said, but I wasn't allowed to use them. The skills I had to have were factory skills that I had no talent for, but I had to learn how to survive with them. Even in his late 50s, early 60s, this still hung like a stigma and a shame because we decided these things early. So I went across the country to university, and they went down the hill to the factory at the bottom of the street. Now in time, they both worked their way up into it, like you could then. So you could do night school and things like that. But they were always kind of running against the grain. And my middle brother, Colin, what he loved was sport. But there wasn't really any place for him at school. He was actually in the same class as David Lloyd, the cricketer, who became captain of England, major TV commentator. And what Colin would complain about, and Colin was a brilliant fast bowler, could swing it one way and get it to come back the pitch off the other way. And he claims to have bowled out David Lloyd 3 times in one.
Who's going to question him?
It's probably a family myth. But it points out that, you know, David came from the right side of town. So he had his parents behind him. He had money. He could afford the kit. He could afford the time in the evenings. Colin couldn't afford the kit. Couldn't afford to do it. Had to leave school at 15. And so he was then like working in factories. So he was busy like earning a living. Then he started hanging around with the wrong people for a while because he was mixing with different people now. So David Lloyd, he feels their skills were similar. And David Lloyd got the chance to be David Lloyd. And he only got the chance to kind of move on into factories. So they both had a lot of resentments about their education. They're in their own ways, they're as smart as I am, but just smart in different ways. But our schools decided early on very different destinies for us.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they hold on to that. Like that's a long time to hold on to that too, right?
Yeah,
Because
there's
it
a
really
book
does
in
make a difference.
there's a book in the 1970s by Richard Sennett, who's still alive. He's an American at London University now.
Yeah.
Writes is a sociologist, and Richard Sennett, Sennett, in the 1970s wrote a book called The Hidden Injuries of Class, and he interviewed working class men about many things, including their experience of schooling. And most of these men, because they were working class, they did badly at school, um, and, and and they carried this sense of shame with them for the rest of their lives. This when you fail at school, it's not over with when you've left school. You carry it with you as an emotional burden for the rest of your life. Now, there's nothing wrong with a working class life. In fact, part of the book argues, and I think with essential workers now, we need to give more dignity to working class education, to education in trades, vocational work. Many of these are transforming, becoming more technical. I think we'll bring more manufacturing back home as a result of COVID-19 because the supply chains globally have looked so fragile. So countries like Germany give a lot more dignity to working class. It has high status, it has complexity. Not all working class people are poor. Car workers, steel workers, many working class traders, they're well paid, they have dignity, they have unionization, they have stability. But of course, the gig economy has been trying to break all that up, and the crisis with care homes, not in Australia, but in Canada, in the US, and in the UK, has been because people have been working in 2 or 3 care homes at the same time because they can't make a living in one. So many of the things that gave working class people pride, stability, dignity, have been stripped away from them by the gig economy. So nobody identifies or is engaged with any work they do anywhere. They just have to move from place to place in order to put food on the table, basically.
Well, Andy, I've got a question for you that's come in from Tony. He says, from your experience, do you now have any particular practical guidance for systems to help them to provide more equitable education now?
Yeah, lots. So I'm not going to tell you all because you'll not read the book. But
we'll put the link for the resources too, Andy, on the website so that everyone can get access to your book.
But I'll just pick 3 random ones. One is make the curriculum really engaging for the kids. This doesn't mean that actually all the curriculum has to be relevant, serious, purposeful, sanctimonious. You don't have to give people climate change fatigue so that everything you do on the curriculum is about, climate change or whatever it might be. That is a big part of it. But whether it's through the content or pedagogically, make the curriculum engaging for the kid wherever they come from, whatever their life is. Sometimes that'll be about compelling social issues. Sometimes it'll be something connected to your community. Sometimes it'll be you're teaching Moby Dick, which looks like it has no relationship to your life whatsoever. That's about whaling in the 19th century. I mean, how could that be connected to anybody? But teach it in a way that shows all people suffer, all people have burdens. Many people sometimes feel like, call me Ishmael, because all this suffering and all these plagues really are inflicted upon me. So always pedagogically think how this connects to your lives. And in high school, we often think, well, we have to teach all the curriculum, we have to rush through it. And a big issue about COVID-19 is forget a lot of the curriculum and rushing through it. In Ontario, when schools go back in the fall, kids will be there half time. So what teachers are having to do is either they can teach the whole curriculum faster or more superficially, but what they're actually doing is ditching half the curriculum. And you know what? They're not finding it a problem at all. No. What was felt to be impossible in the past, miss out Boyle's law about, volume and pressure and temperature in gas. Nobody will die. Miss out the War of the Spanish Succession. people's lives will not be ruined by it. So think not how much curriculum there is and how much you have to get through, but think about how pedagogically or through the content you connect this curriculum to people's imaginations, to their lives, to how they learn best. I'd say that is one of the absolutely key things. I'd say secondly is change the university application form. So when you put down, they'll ask you so when I filled in my application form, I thought I've got nothing to put here. I've not been in any clubs. I've not been on any teams. Actually, I couldn't stand team spirit. I was awesome at football and everything else in my community. But the old school tie, if you buy into one thing, you're often selling out of something else. So I felt I got nothing to put on my form. But what I loved doing that didn't cost any money usually was hiking across bleak northern moors. And that is not what the elite were then about. Now you've got Duke of Edinburgh's award and things, and it's more valued. I planned and executed at the age of 17 a 270-mile hiking trip up the backbone of England with my girlfriend. So off I went at 17 with my girlfriend to walk 270 miles over Easter in like snow and rain. And I thought this had nothing to do with a university application. Looking after my mum, I thought had nothing to do with a university application. So on a university application form, have a space on the form and in the interview to ask people about their families, what they've done with their, and there'll be many kids from working families, immigrant families, who've done so much more in their family and community than privileged kids from middle-class families who've ticked all the right boxes in getting the right CV so that they can have the life that followed. And third and last is abolish all internships. Abolish all internships, except through accredited educational institutions, which might be schools or universities. That means then everybody gets a chance for the plum internship with Goldman Sachs or UNESCO or whoever it might be, not just the privileged kids who've got the inside connections from their families. Abolish internships, you remove free labor from organizations, unpaid labor. So you're saying to corporations, you want labor, you got to pay for it fairly, like everybody else, unless you're on an accredited training program and deliberately mentoring people to move into the profession. So there's lots more in the book, but if I tell them all to you, you'll not read the book. But these are just like three very definite kind of how-tos.
And I've got to say, you going back about university applications, I didn't go to university till the age of 30. So I finished school in year 10, went straight into an apprenticeship, and it wasn't until 30 that I applied. And if I didn't apply the following year, I wouldn't have got those. I went, sat all the exams, but they said, apply this year. I did it. If I waited 1 year, I wouldn't have got in. So, you know, it was determined on how many people they were taking into the university that year.
Yeah, some people's social mobility is luck. I mean, there's luck in my life. We lived in a council house when I was 9 years old. And then my dad came home one day from work and walked up the garden. And my mum had had a really bad day. She had had an argument with a neighbour, and then the milk had fallen over on the step. And that was a big thing if you're a working class woman to keep your step clean, because it's what everybody could see. So she was very agitated. And my dad said to her, sit down, because it was very calm. It had to be. And he said, sit down. And she said, what do you mean? He said, sit down. And she said, all right. She said, well, what is it? She said, sit down. So she sat down. And then he said, read this. So I handed her an envelope. And the envelope said, you have won £500 from the Sunday People for correctly listing 12 reasons to brush your teeth in the correct order and penning a superior caption to anybody else. £5,000 then is about £10,000, $25,000 now. And my mum wouldn't believe it. She thought it was a trick because she couldn't actually believe that anything positive could happen in her life at that point. But it was true. And it gave us enough money for a deposit on a very tiny 2 up, 2 down terraced house, no indoor bathroom, no indoor toilet, but it was ours. And as my mum said, we'll always have bricks and mortar over our heads. And when my dad died, that became absolutely critical. And so when we moved, it wasn't just that we got a little house, but we had different neighbours now. So our neighbours now were not all off the council estate, and people in working jobs, some of them quite rough, some respectable, some rough. But now our neighbours were office workers, teachers, policemen. We had. I was going around to different kids' houses rather than the kids' houses I was going around to, when I was like 6, 7, and 8. So a complete stroke of luck meant that we're still on the wrong side of town, but we're in the better part of the wrong side of town, if you like. Yeah. And it was complete. So often in social mobility, there is kind of individual struggle, resilience, a positive spirit, creativity, ingenuity, knowing how to work your way around a system if you can't get through it. I've learned to be very good at that. If people tell me something can't be done, I get really interested. And think, oh, it can't be done, eh? We'll see about that. And then I'll find an unusual way around that other people haven't been able to find. Some of it comes from the institution, which might sometimes just be finding the right teacher at the right time, who will take you under their wing a bit. And I had one in primary school and probably a couple in most of the others were useless.
So would you say they were mentored? Did you have mentors in your life?
So mentor is an interesting term. I never, I don't really think I became aware even of the idea of mentoring and coaching until my 40s, either as giving or as receiving. I just thought of it as people who helped you, or people you helped in return. I think when you're younger and you're getting mentored, you often don't realize it. I think we're more explicit now about saying, I'm your mentor, and so on, but nobody said that. And I've had lots of people who've tried to help me along at critical stages. I'd say that until my 40s, I was totally uninterested in educational leadership. Totally uninterested, because, and I talk about this in the book, almost all the leaders I had were men, leaders of me. I gave them a hard time, a bit of an angry young man, but mainly they deserved it, because they were self-serving, narcissistic, manipulative, hierarchical, and there were all the bad things about male leaders that many women in leadership rightly complain about. And these were just not the kind of leaders that I wanted to be. And I only really started beginning to think of myself as a leader when more younger men, and particularly more women, started to move into leadership, and leadership began to synchronize with more with kind of moral purpose, really, and collective good. But there were some, as I say, most of the people who were older than me, it was the time, were men then. There were very few women who were in senior positions. And I can think of one that nobody will have heard of, called Peter Woods. And Peter Woods was a professor at the Open University. I was in my 20s. I was in a teacher's college, applied for a job at the Open University, the world's first distance learning institution, then the top university in the world in my field, which was sociology of education. So I knew I was going to be interviewed for a job. He was the head of department. And so I was in a kind of phase of my life where intellectually I would take the work of the biggest person in the field and I would utterly tear it to pieces. It's just the way I was. There were lots of reasons for it. And I was brilliant at it, actually. But not all good, really. And so Peter Woods ran a conference for 30 people. I was the youngest person there. Everybody knew I was in for a job. He was going to be my boss. He was running the conference. So it came time for my paper. So I read my paper, and it became a brilliant destruction of like big theory of societies, then a brilliant destruction of small theory of everyday interactions. And then I said, and then there are a few people who've tried to bridge the two, and one of them is Peter Woods. And then very slowly, I began to tear his work apart, limb from limb. And everybody, when I started to do it at first, people thought, this is an interesting strategy. This is, wonder how this is going to go. And then as I just got deeper and deeper into it, they all went like this. And
career
thought,
suicide.
Oh my God, he has totally blown it now. And when I'd finished, and it was brilliant, but like so inappropriate, a silence swept the room. It just swept the room. And then Peter Woods sat back, and he looked around the room, and he took a long sigh, and he said, well then, he said, I guess that's back to the drawing board for Woods. and everybody burst out laughing, because basically it was empathetic, but of course a little bit ironic. And I would do anything for that. He's still alive, he's in his 80s now, I correspond with him. I would do anything for that man for the rest of my life, actually. And he was a huge supporter of my work, even though it was very difficult to deal with sometimes. I'm less difficult now, but I'm still pretty argumentative and critical. So what is a mentor? I think when I've mentored people, they haven't always realized they're mentoring. The people have fought me, like I fought him. They do sometimes. Because when you're a young scholar, if you're any good, you don't want to repeat the work of the people. You want to find your own space, and I really encourage people to do that.
And so
but usually some people at the time know what's happening, and are grateful. Other people, most other people, it hits them later. And then you find about 3, 4, 5 years later, not only are they talking to you, but they're talking to other people about what it is you've done to help develop them, not as an Austin Powers mini-me, but as somebody who's got something, and professionally, that they might not even be able to see themselves yet, but you can somehow help bring that forward in them, because it's not just good for them, but because if they're any good at it, it'll benefit a lot of other people.
Yeah. And so you I was talking to Trista, and she said you looked into coaching quite a few years ago.
Yeah, I did a paper. I've no idea how I got into. Well, actually, I do know how I got into this. I was at Toronto by then, working with Michael Fulham, who, by the way, has been a great mentor. And like a good mentor, he's always seen that it's not at all one-way traffic; it's two-way traffic. And I've no idea who's more famous, Michael Fulham or me. It'll depend on who you talk to. But for both of us, it doesn't matter. We invented the concept of professional capital together. And people ask me often, well, yeah, but whose was it really? Like who said professional capital first? And I say, well, one of us did, but it doesn't matter, because it would never have evolved unless we'd
had collaboration,
right? Unless we'd done this months, years of work together. So Michael Fulham was the dean when I moved to the University of Toronto. We'd started to work together a bit, and there was a consortium of 4 school districts, and they'd brought in 2 people, Barry and Carol Rollheiser. They were then married, Rollheiser Bennett. They did great things, fantastic training on classroom management, cooperative learning. They went out, trained hundreds, thousands of teachers in these 4 big districts. Everybody loved it. And then they wanted a bit of research doing. And so I had a graduate student who did the research, a woman called Ruth Daw. And Ruth did the research and found that actually everybody loved the training and most people were implementing it because it didn't fit the cultures of their schools. And when we said this to the districts, they were devastated because they said, well, everybody loves the training. Barry and Carol are great. It's fantastic. Everybody enjoys it. Yes, it is. But hardly anybody's implementing it. And they said, well, why? And we said, well, it's leadership. And it's an individualistic culture. There's no collaborative culture within the schools to support it when people go back. So then we got into the issue of how the process of coaching is not just an individual one-on-one thing, but how it's a collective thing to do with a group in a school. And there was lots of coaching then, and has been since, that was really about an individual thing. And actually it was often compliance. It was really the coach is the spy. The coach is making sure you implement something with fidelity in the way that you're supposed to. So Ruth and I wrote a piece called Coaching as Unreflective Practice. And we talked about the critical side of coaching and then laid out what coaching looked like in a whole school context, in the culture of collaboration, rather than on a one-on-one relationship within an individualistic culture.
Cool, I'm going to have to look up that paper, aren't I? And I've got a couple of questions for you. This is from Wendy. She says, how can teachers intervene to lessen the chance of students taking shame, real or perceived, into adulthood?
Thanks, Wendy. That's a great. I don't know where you're from, Wendy, but you know that is a splendid question. And the answer is lots of ways. I think firstly, just understanding the child and understanding the child's life and understanding the child's family. A second is, of course, understand that they're vulnerable, may be vulnerable. And pay attention to that. I think one of the most important things during COVID was not starting online lessons as fast as you could, but just connecting with the families and seeing who was vulnerable, who was not vulnerable, building a relationship with them, providing support for them. But also understand that not all people who are poor have nothing. And I think part of the COVID discourse has been assuming that all people who are poor live in crowded apartments, are ashamed of where they are, can't go out and play, can't do anything, don't have any materials, and it's often true they don't have stuff, but their lives, their families and cultures often have assets. We're more likely to understand what these assets are with immigrant families and with indigenous cultures than often we are with working class cultures, which will see us poor, and as just lacking things, parents interested in education and so on. So one thing is to start to see what these kids have and their families have, and not only what they're missing. It's not an either or. It's with most of us as a combination. We have some things and we don't have other things. Keep an eye on them, keep them connected with the other kids, build. You didn't say whether you're high school or primary, but build a culture in the school where people are very accepting and inclusive of each other's differences, curious about each other's lives. We have a book coming out on student engagement in a few months, with many examples from our work in Canada. And so this includes things like, the school will adopt a Syrian refugee family and raise money for a Syrian refugee family. Study the impact of the word of the day in vocabulary will be an Arabic word sometimes. So then the Arabic kids and then the other kids say, whoa, these words are really cool. Can we have more of these? So we tend to think of refugees who come from war-torn countries. They have nothing. They've got post-traumatic stress. They've lost their families, they've suffered violence, we tend to think all the time what they don't have, but also we have to think about do have, and build a culture that can actually strengthen that, whether they're working class, refugees, immigrants, poor, LGBTQ, indigenous, whatever really work hard on knowing the child, knowing the culture, knowing their relationship, and don't stereotype it. So one of my favorite books is by Ishmael Bia, and Ishmael Bia was a lost boy, a soldier from Sierra Leone who grew up in Sierra Leone, was a village was destroyed when he was a child, walked across the country, almost starved to death, lost half his family, was kidnapped by the military, forced to fight against his will, dosed up with crack cocaine, and murdered people in cold blood, including executing them, shooting them in the feet just to torture them while he was a child. And then he was rescued by the UN. He was re-educated in a way, adopted by a family in America, moved to America, and then talked about how his school completely failed to connect with him. So the question is, you have Ishmael Bia in your class. What is relevant to Ishmael Bia? What is, you know, we tend to think culturally responsive teaching is, if you're indigenous, you need this. If you're African American, you need this. If you're LGBTQ, you need this. But the thing is you need to know about Ishmael Bia, that it comes from West Africa. He loves soccer, which is a colonial import. So it's not authentically indigenous West African culture, but there's hardly a boy in West Africa that doesn't play soccer. So he loves that. And at 7 years old, he used to, in front of his village elders, recite soliloquies from Shakespeare because he loves the language of Shakespeare. So to know Ishmael Bia, you can't say, oh, we need something African-American for Ishmael Bia. You need to know all of Ishmael Bia. And some of the answers are classic, and some of the answers are completely off the wall, but you need to know him as an individual.
Thanks, Andy. We've got a question, our last one for this evening, from Carolyn Martin. As we head into a period of austerity, how do we guard against our education providers being pushed into simply creating curriculum to feed economy rather than ensuring our education systems feed society's needs?
First of all, I'm opposed to austerity. I don't think it's inevitable. In wartime, we racked up massive debts, and not every country went into huge austerity. Austerity isn't inevitable. More debt is possible, paying it off more slowly over a longer period. All countries have debt, practically. So don't buy the austerity shtick. That is the first thing. Secondly, people will use austerity against public education. So there are papers now coming out, again, another wave of urging people to move into private education, using public money to support private education, which of course also happens wrongly, in my view, within Australia. You want private education, get private education, there's a place for it. Don't expect the public to pay for it. It's just kind of really simple for me, because education is a public good for most people. I've seen things now, I won't say where they come from, but part of the big edutech discourse is what looks like, when we're going back to school, looks like compassion for older teachers, which is, if you're 55 or older, the system could offer you early retirement because you're vulnerable and you can't go in. What this means for edutech is, you're 55 and over, you're old, expensive, and in the way. Move on, please, and we'll let the younger people come behind who are kind of all savvy with technology, won't get in the way. We'll leave more tax dollars available that we can spend on devices and software for the big tech education companies. And the ed tech companies will also say, oh, what we can bring in now post-COVID is a learning anytime, anywhere. We won't always need buildings, but what we've learned during COVID is we need schools so that parents can go to work. We're never going to have, for most people, like learning anytime, anywhere. We need learning here and now, not anytime, anywhere, so that the kids can also learn together in community, and that when we do that, of course we use technology, but we use it to support and enrich what it is teachers are doing, not instead. So watch out for all of these. People will tell you austerity is inevitable. It's not. They'll tell you we can learn anytime, anywhere. We've learned from COVID that we can't, because a lot of kids just can't get engaged if there's special ed, if they've no space to study, if they don't have enough devices. We need schools as places because their parents need to go to work. So the answer is 80, 90% in schools. It's here and now. It's not anywhere. We don't need to move teachers 55 and over out the way. You know, you give up people early retirement when they got nowhere to travel, nothing to do. How humanitarian is that? Unless when the kids go back, they're going to need more help, because they're going to have had time not sitting in a circle, not learning how to line up, not learning how to take your turn, listen to other people. We'll have vulnerable kids who've had the equivalent of post-traumatic stress, especially dysfunctional families. We'll need more counselling. We'll need more special ed. We'll need more additional support, not less. We actually need more money, not less. Austerity is not inevitable. Stand up and fight it.
Well, we're going to finish on that note. Thank you, Andy, for this evening. It's been wonderful to talk to you about moving education and social mobility. Really appreciate your time tonight, and we will put the link on for people to purchase the book from you. I just wanted to ask, because the last thing I wanted to say that your mum heard about the book that you've written about her.
Yes, she did. So, you know, when you read the book, I mean, this has been a fairly earnest discussion, but people who've read it, including the organisers of writers' festivals who deal with people like Margaret Atwood and so on, they have told me this is one of the best pieces of literature that they've ever read. And there are lots of reasons for that. One was deliberately I wanted to write differently. This is not a book about an extraordinary life. It's a book about the life that lots of people have led, but don't necessarily have been able to find the way to write about in the way that I can. Sometimes it's funny. A couple of points, it's probably hilarious. If you want to learn what dining at high table is like at Oxford, then you know, with Cutler with wingspans of 747s, then you know you can read that. You can read that in this book, and it's a book that I've deliberately tried to write in ways that connect with people, not say I've had this extraordinary life, look at me, but lots of ordinary people have extraordinary lives, but never think like the children of famous people that they're going to be somebody. So they never keep diaries, records, logs, documents. But our lives, the lives of people like me and my mum and her family and her people and her culture are worth writing about. And the moment I realized this for the first time was when my mum was 93, and she was very ill. She had had a very painful condition for several years that really no cure for, called trigeminal neuralgia. It's called the suicide pain. It's a nerve here that brings searing pain. You can control it a bit, but not much. You can operate, but it's a 5-hour operation through the brain, and impossible when you're in your 90s. So pretty much by the time she hit her 90s, she decided she'd had enough, and stopped eating and stopped drinking. So I sat with her for 9 days while she was unconscious, almost all the time. Wasn't the only one, other family members as well. And I'm very much a can-do kind of person. So I'm sitting there thinking, so what can I do? I mean, here's one of the worst things you face in your life. Your mother's dying, you can't stop it. She's unconscious. Like what can you do? And I decided there were 3 things I could do. One is I could just be there. I could just be there. I could witness, even if she knew I was there or not, I could witness her life and the end of her life. And the time went very fast. I was amazed how fast the time went. It's time to meditate, to think, to reflect. I thought the second thing I can do is I can read to her. So I had no idea whether she could hear. I was fairly confident she couldn't by this time. But I read, for Australian listening to this, I read to her one of her favourite books, which is Neville Shute's A Town Like Alice. So I read that, and I enjoyed it, actually. I'd never read it, never read it before, so it was good for me too. And then thirdly, I thought, what can I do? You know, I have to do something. Well, I thought, well, I'm a writer. I can write. So very early on, almost immediately, I like drafted something out fairly quickly, not just about her, but about her life, really, about the life of working class people, working class women like her of her generation. And I sent it off to the Lancashire Telegraph, which is the local newspaper for the whole of East Lancashire. I mean, a big area like, I don't know, like Melbourne or something like that. And they replied immediately, and they said, this is great. They edited it a bit, and they said, we're going to publish it, double-page spread. Do you have any pictures? So we had loads of pictures from her 90th birthday, sent them off. And then immediately, this all happened very fast. They sent back like a rough copy. So I sat with my mum. This must have been about 2 days now before she died. And I leaned right over her, like almost like face to face like this. And I said, Mum, I don't know whether you can hear me, but I've got something to tell you. And I want you to know I've written something about you and your life, and what you've done and what you stood for. And it's going in the Lancashire Telegraph. And they're going to make it a double-page spread. And I said, it's all about your mum, and it's a double-page spread. And here's how it starts. And I said, the heading is how a working class mum scrimped and sacrificed for her family. And then I just read out like the first two sentences, and it began, Doris Hargreaves. By the way, my mum was called Doris because the nurse who saved my grandfather's life during the 1919 flu pandemic was called Doris. So they named my mum after the nurse who saved my grandfather's life in the 1919 pandemic. And the article starts by saying, Doris Hargreaves was born in a commode at the back of a sweet shop in Accrington at the end of the Great War. And I just got that far, and we thought it was impossible. She'd had no fluid for like 9 days, and then a single tear just came down her cheek. And at that point, I thought there was something here, not just about her, but about all the millions of people like her. And people wrote to me, you know, they wrote to me about how it spoke to them, how it moved them in a way, people in the area, people in my job who saw it, you know, published online. So that, if there was one moment, that was the moment when I thought there's something bigger to do here, not just to write a kind of rambling memoir of irrelevant memories from a time that people have long forgotten, but to write something that is timeless, really, about working class lives, not just working class lives, but as I say at one point, this is a book for people who sacrifice. This is a book for people who've given something up. This is a book for people who've worked extra jobs. This is a book for people who've left behind a homeland, so that they can give their children better opportunities than they have. And those are millions of people. And
or they're your students or your relatives or a friend you might know. I mean, I think everyone, if you read the book and the things I've read, you can connect in some way to somebody you know or an experience somebody else has had.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so if anybody listening, if you, the book is called Moving, a memoir of education and social mobility. If you read it, whether you like it or you don't, please feel free to just email me or post on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, what you get from it, any questions you have about it, and as far as I'm able, I'll respond to anything you have to say.
well, thank you so much, Andy. We might call it an evening for us, or it's an early morning for you over there. So thank you again for your generosity. And
Thanks,
we'll
Andrew.
talk soon. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, been a pleasure to work with you. All the best and good luck to everybody listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.